Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another one of our Leica Academy How to Take Better Photograph sessions. I know from seeing some of the names coming up on my screen here that quite a few of you have been to the previous episode. So this is episode number 4. And tonight we're going to be tackling that gnarly subject of depth of field. And when I say gnarly, it is definitely a subject which really confuses people. It's very hard to explain, and I'm going to do my level best to try and translate the theory into the practical. We're not going to delve into the mathematics tonight. You will be very pleased to hear. I do have a link to a YouTube video which goes into all that if you are feeling up to it. However, it's very complicated. So what I want to do for you this evening is to try and distill down the important aspects of depth of field and what it really is and how to use it, rather than drilling down into numbers and all sorts of things like that. So let me just make sure that everybody's hearing me okay. I've got Vincent Ip. Hello, Vincent, Chris, Luke, Jonathan, Hans-Dieter from Munich. Got a couple of people from Germany this evening, which is great. Mike Whitby from Fremantle, Stephen from Sydney, Peter from Armadale. So we've got a really good turnout this evening. So the reason I'm hesitating a little bit is because I'm hoping that I can do a good job of explaining in a useful way. And what I want this to be is useful information. I can explain the mathematics to you if I need to, but not in the format of an hour like this. And also, I'm not convinced it would be necessarily that useful to you unless you happen to be into mathematics and so on. What I want to do is show you what depth of field is used for, and some maybe prick some of the little bubble myths that are out there about how it all works. So why don't I actually start off by getting into my little show here, and hopefully if I pop that button there, you'll see me in the bottom left hand corner. I've got a new rig here, so it's supposed to be a little bit more polished this evening, and hopefully getting a nice sharp image. So if somebody could just pop a comment in the chat here just to confirm that everybody's seeing everything okay. So depth of field. What do we mean by depth of field? Well, it's, like I said, a slippery concept. So here's a picture of some tulips. This is from Canada. This is Butchart Gardens in Canada. And you can see very clearly that middle section. And if I just tap this little button here, I can point on my screen. How cool is this? Look at this. Awesome. That area there, or if I just draw some lines along it like that, you can see that area there is distinctly sharper than the rest of it. Okay, no question about it. That's because it was taken on a telephoto lens, and I've only focused on these tulips here. That's thrown this area out of focus and this area out of focus. And it divides the image into 3 nice bands using color, exposure, and depth of field, because only some of those tulips are sharp. So that's a creative use of depth of field to draw your attention to something that me, as the photographer, deem interesting. I'm using it in a creative way. But the thing is, what actually are we looking at here? Where does the sharp bit finish and the blurred bit start? And that's essentially what depth of field is, isn't it? It's that region between the 2 green lines on the screen where things look sharper than the rest of the picture. So I'm going to be fairly specific with my words because it's important. It's apparent depth of field. And that's the region between the nearest and farthest point that's acceptably sharp. And those words I use, like I said, very carefully, because acceptably sharp isn't the same as sharp. An apparent depth of field means what looks like it's in focus, but in actual fact it might not be. And well, we'll come back to that point in a sec. And also consider the effects of areas which are not in focus. And that's to do with the distance between your subject and the background and various other factors, lens type, aperture, things like that. And it's the combination of the two that gives you that creative control over where you draw the attention of your viewer to. And that's the key thing here, is are you wanting to draw the attention of your viewer to a specific spot, Or are you saying, hey, look at this big scene in front of me and it's all beautifully sharp, and so that the person can at their leisure examine that picture like a big print on the wall or something, and examine that picture, and everywhere is sharp. Okay, so that's something that we use depth of field for. Typical landscape. This is Brisbane. This is actually quite an old picture of Brisbane, funnily enough. The first picture I ever took on the medium format Leica, the S2 as it was then. That's all in focus. So every part of that picture is crisp because there is enough depth of field to cover the trees here through to the city buildings here. Now, those trees are probably 200 meters away, I'm guessing, and these buildings are probably 400 meters away, I'm guessing, but they're all nice and sharp. And then you get a picture like this, which is obviously a typical portrait, where only the eyes are sharp, but the background's not, and the subject stands out from the background. So that's two opposite extremes of depth of field. And as I conclude this talk, and I will repeat myself during the talk, I'll be talking about not much and lots of depth of field, as opposed to a specific amount. And that's why that's really because I'm trying to avoid calculating depth of field. I will touch on that subject. So for those of you who want to really nerd out on the whole thing, I will give you some information about how you can calculate it. But I'm going to try and leave you this evening with the idea that it's not necessarily helpful to do that. Okay? All right, so everybody seems to be happy with the broadcast this evening, and we have 73 people taking part so far, which is a pretty good turnout, so thank you for that. Okay, so let's get into this. So this is probably the most technical diagram I'm going to show you this evening. What you are looking at here is clearly me. See, that's me, definitely, and that's my camera. Not a very good representation of a light, but anyway. I'm focused on that person there. And if I use an aperture of f11, and this is not to scale, as they say, I'll probably get a region between these two red lines that's acceptably sharp. And that means that the two figures are both equally sharp. Okay? If I shoot the same picture, now here's a very key thing to remember. There are, and we'll come to these factors in a sec, there are about 5 different things which affect depth of field. If you change one of them, the depth of field changes. But if you change 2 of them, which is what happens usually, it becomes a lot more difficult to work out. So in this particular diagram, we're using the same lens, the same camera, the same focus point, the same subject, the same everything, and all we're doing is changing the aperture. In which case, at f11, we'd have between these 2 red lines, and at f2, only the subject figure would be sharp, and the second figure and the third figure, I suppose that's the second figure, isn't it? This figure here and this figure here will be progressively less sharp. And that's another important thing to remember. Depth of field is a complete illusion. There is only one thing literally sharp in your picture, and that's whatever you're focused on. That defines your focus point. Either side of that focus point, so either in front of or behind, becomes progressively less sharp. So it's a continuum. So the figure in the front here, this figure here, will be considerably out of focus. This figure will be sharp. At f2, this figure will be out of focus, and this figure will be much more out of focus. So it's not a hard dividing line. There's no sudden cutoff between in focus and out of focus. This is a very important concept because it seems that, well, I say it seems, it is a fact that how you view the image later, this is very counterintuitive, but how you view that image later has an enormous effect on the depth of field. You're probably thinking that depth of field is something that you establish at the time you shoot it. And I'm not talking about iPhones where you can change the focus later with some clever computational business. I'm talking about simple lenses, simple capture. The depth of field is also related very strongly to your viewing medium. Phone, iPad, print, big print, how far away from the print is, and we'll get into that in a sec. Now that is counterintuitive. Please do ask questions if you feel the need. I'll do my best to answer them. The chat is probably the best place to answer those questions because I can see all the chat coming up on the screen to my right here. So if you do have a quick question, do lob that in, but I will proceed. So I just want to make that point that depth of field is quite literally an optical illusion. And that's why I use the term acceptably sharp. Something appears to be acceptably sharp because it's within the parameters that we've set for what we are calling sharpness. It's sharp enough for our purposes. Okay, so hold that thought. Here's a little bit of an example. So this is a bit nerdy, I know, but believe me, we're going to get past this. The apparent range of sharpness is when you cannot tell the difference between a tiny dot, which is a sharp bit of detail, and an out of focus dot. And if you look at these dots at the top of the screen here, or along here, they are all different sizes. I've set this up so that they're all different sizes on your screen. It's very, very hard to tell where those middle dots start to become discs. Now, looking at the screen as I am now, which is about a meter away from me, I'm looking from here to here and outside that range. So from here to the right and from about here to the left, those are definitely discs, not dots. But between those 2 points, those dots all look about the same size to me. That would be your acceptable range of sharpness. That would be your depth of field. The reality is that those dots are all different sizes, but the difference between them is less than the ability of your eye to resolve. That's what depth of field is. It's when the blur is so small that your eye is not capable of distinguishing it from a sharp dot. Okay, I hope that makes sense because it's a really important point. And so there comes a point either side where those become blurred and now it's out of focus. So that dot is out of focus. But from about here to about here, you get the illusion of a sharp dot. And that's what I was saying before about how it's a grey area where it transitions and then it progressively gets more and more out of focus towards the camera and more out of focus away from the camera. Okay. Now, I'm not going to get into this business, circles of confusion, because that will mess with your head. But if you are determined to generate a headache and really get confused by all this stuff, circles of confusion, I urge you to maybe, you'll be able to watch this video later, but if you want to take a grab of that URL there, it's a YouTube video URL. And this is a guy in Switzerland called Math Photographer, which probably explains a lot about his approach. And in this particular video, he compares 2 different sensor sizes, one of which is the Leica SL2, and one is a medium format camera of a different brand. And he calculates to the nth degree all of the things that we'll be talking about. And like, knock yourself out, watch it. If that floats your boat, great. But I don't find it useful. What I'm going to share with you are the useful concepts that this all leads to. Okay, so we're not going to get into the mathematics. All right, let's get on to the next slide. So here we go. There are 5 factors, and people will disagree about this. But I've been doing this for quite a long time. I did study photography in the 80s and 90s, and none of this has changed. It's all the same optics, okay? And some of these aspects of your photography can be confused with each other. And what you'll find is when people disagree about calculating depth of field, you'll often find that they're changing 2 things, not 1 thing. So when people talk about wide-angle lenses having more depth of field than telephoto lenses, that is true up to a point. And it's up to a useful point, a practical point. But it's actually also true that you can make a wide-angle lens have the same depth of field as a telephoto lens, but you have to change more than 1 thing. So this is where it gets a bit confusing, because all of these things have an effect on the final result. So first, aperture, lens focal length, sensor size, camera to subject distance, very, very important. We'll come back to that in a little while. And the viewing size of the image later, also Very, very important. And as I said before, rather counterintuitive. Okay. So let's go through those one at a time. The first one is an easy one. I mean, we should, all of us who've been taking photographs for a little bit will probably have noticed that when you take a picture at a different aperture, you get quite a different result of the focus, the relationship of the focus between the subject and the background. Now, this is just a rose in my garden, and I've shot at f1.4 and at f16 on the same lens and from the same position. So I've just plonked my tripod down. I think it's a 50mm lens, but it doesn't matter for the purposes of this. It's the same lens, same exposure, same everything. All that I've changed is the aperture. And can you see in the right-hand picture how much more distracting that background is? That's from a creative point of view. I would say that the left-hand picture is vastly more appealing because as a photographer, you're drawing the attention of the viewer to your subject and making it stand out for the background. And the same goes for portraits as well. So far, this is probably nothing that you wouldn't already understand. Okay. Second concept, and this is getting a little bit more tricky. If I just move my head, that says wide-angle lenses have greater depth of field than telephoto lenses. Now, this is a little bit tricky because, as I said a few seconds ago, it is possible to argue that it's not about the lens, it's about the distance to the subject. But there's a bit more to it than that. So rather than confuse the message by delving into the edge cases, let's just say, and this is true, that a wide-angle lens, all things being equal, has a greater depth of field than a telephoto lens. So this is the same crocodile, almost actually it's not quite the same crocodile. If you look carefully, you'll see that the right-hand one is in a slightly different position. But the important thing is they're both about the same distance from the boat. And the left-hand one was taken on a standard 50mm lens equivalent, and the right-hand one was taken on a telephoto 280mm equivalent. And I think it's fairly obvious that the eye on the right-hand side, this crocodile here, is much sharper than the nose. So in this image, the depth of field, so the area of acceptable sharpness, probably extends from about where the red spot is now through to here. Now, that crocodile's head is probably 1 meter long. It's a big crocodile. So that is maybe 20 centimeters. It's hard to tell, but let's call it 20 centimeters. On the left-hand image, as you see this on the screen, you'll probably think that that tail is equally sharp compared to the head. So the depth of field is maybe 3 meters. Now, that's not quite true, as will become apparent later, because if I enlarge this picture more, you'll see that the snout isn't quite sharp. But the impression that we get on the screen now, in that left-hand picture, is that the crocodile is sharp from head to tail, and in the right-hand picture it's not. And I should also mention they were both taken at the same aperture, which I didn't put on the screen, which is a bit remiss of me. They were both taken at about f4. So because it's a 280 f4 and it's a 50mm f, I would have shot it at f4. So looking in the metadata, so everything's equivalent. Same distance to subject, camera to subject, same aperture, but what we've varied is the lens and the wider angle. It's not our wide angle lens per se, 50mm, but obviously the telephoto is a magnification of almost 6, whereas a 50mm is a magnification of 1. So there's a big difference there. And the telephoto lens has less depth of field. Okay. This is where it starts to get a little bit more slippery. So there's 2 pictures of me, as it turns out, both taken with a 28mm angle of view lens, and roughly the same aperture. And when I say angle of view, what I mean by that is the left-hand picture is taken on an iPhone. And that's a very, very small sensor. And the angle of view on your basic phone is 28mm. And if you look in the metadata of the pictures in Lightroom, you'll see it says 28mm equivalent. So I know that for a fact. It also reports the aperture, and it said 1.8. The right-hand picture is like a Q. Not the Q2, but like a Q. And that's a 28mm lens, and it's an f1.7 lens. And you should be able to see very, very clearly in that picture that the right-hand image has much, much less depth of field than the left-hand image. In the left-hand image, the horizon is almost completely sharp. And in the right-hand image, the background funfair is really out of focus. And that's because of the sensor size. So bigger sensor, less depth of field. And that extends up from full frame cameras up into medium format cameras. And winding the clock back to my early days in photography, large format cameras, when you've got film, which is 10:8, you had no depth of field at all. It was very, very difficult to get anything sharp. You had to shoot at like f/64 to get things sharp front to back. That's because of the larger sensor or film size. So all of these are built into the depth of field calculations, all of the sensor sizes, lens, focal length, angle of view, subject distance. And when you distill it down, these are facts. Smaller sensor, greater depth of field. So for instance, if you were shooting on a Leica CL, which is an APS-C sensor, that sensor has what they call a crop factor of 1.5. So everything you have to adjust by a factor of 1.5. So a 35mm lens becomes the equivalent in the angle of view of a 50mm lens. But you also have to adjust the depth of field by the same factor. So what that means is the same lens on the camera, an APS-C camera, will have more depth of field than the same equivalent lens on a full frame camera. In this case, you have to multiply by about 1.5. And in round terms, f1.4 on my CL would be the same depth of field as f2-ish, maybe f2.2, on a full frame camera with the same lens, same equivalent focal length. Now, I'm not going to get into crop factors and so on, but just remember that the smaller the sensor, the greater the depth of field. And this is, again, you can calculate this, and it's absolutely true. Question, Marcella. Thanks for your time. What if a main subject is very close to its background? Say distance is only 1 or 2 centimeters in between. Can you separate the main subject from the background in a practical way? Good question, and I will be talking about that in a little bit, but the simple answer is no. You really can't. The best way to do that would be to shoot from close with a very, very wide aperture lens, so that the relative distance between camera to subject and subject to background is as big as possible. If you stood further away with a telephoto lens, that distance, that relative distance or ratio of distances would be quite different. So it would be very, very hard to do. Now I've just said that, I'm not 100%, I'm telling you the right thing. But basically, if you've got behind, if someone was like standing against a wall, their back of their head was touching a wall, and you focused on their eyes, it would be very, very hard to get that wall very, very out of focus. It would be out of focus to a certain degree, but what you really want is separation. What I said earlier, I'm going to actually contradict myself, and I'm going to say you're probably better off with a telephoto lens from further away, because that will narrow the angle of view behind the subject. But yeah, that's a really gnarly question and gives you an idea of just how complicated this can be. But the answer to your question is no, that's really difficult to do. Okay, moving on before I confuse myself even further. All right, so to what you were just asking me, Marcella, this is to do with the subject distance and the distance to the background. And the key point with these two pictures is, regardless of the aperture, something that's a long way away will all be sharp. So those were both taken on the same lens at the same aperture, but at very different subject distances. So the left-hand picture, that is Brisbane again. That's probably half a kilometre away. And down in the left-hand side, this jetty here, if I was to enlarge this picture considerably, you'd see this jetty is actually sharp, as is the background. So there's enough depth of field to cover maybe 200 metres through to, well, the horizon at f1.4. Now that's a little counterintuitive. So the only way you could ever possibly separate out this jetty from the background is to use a telephoto lens and simply shoot this section of it. But now we've changed the angle of view and we've changed the lens, so it changes the depth of field calculations. Okay. The right-hand picture, I'm stood about 3 meters away from this farmer, and the background behind him is at infinity, as they say. It's the horizon. So the relationship between the 3 meters and the 3,000 meters is humongous, and you can see very clearly how much the depth of field falls off behind his head and makes him stand out. But if you look closely in around here, there's a star picket sticking up there. That's nowhere near as out of focus as the background. So you can see very clearly how that depth of field falls off gradually. But because there's nothing close behind him, he stands out like he's been like cut out. But if there was something close behind him, like a wall, that depth of field would not be sufficient to throw that thing behind him really, really out of focus. Okay, so depth of field increases rapidly with subject distance, and I mean rapidly, very, very rapidly. So when you want to do these limited depth of field effects, regardless of gear and lenses, it only really works when you're close to your subject. And the extension of that is it works against you when you're really, really close to your subject, like you're doing macro work. And as you get really close, photographing tiny things, then you've got so little depth of field, it's astonishing how difficult it is to A, focus in the first place, and B, have any sort of detail except for that one plane which is in focus. So that depth of field drops off, the depth of field drops off as the subject gets closer and increases as it goes further away. Okay. Now this is something else that I did say is going to confuse a lot of people. This is to do with the viewing size. So essentially what it means is that when you capture an image, the depth of field is not fixed, not exactly. There's a limit to it based on, and that's a lower limit of less depth of field, and that is set by the resolution of your sensor, because the resolution of your sensor has a limit on how fine the detail it can resolve. So if you consider a print that's about that big and you're viewing it at a normal reading distance, so if you can, something like that, that has actually been adopted over the years since all of this stuff was calculated as a standard. And almost all of the depth of field calculations that you see and the lens markings that you see, and we'll come back to that in a sec, are based around a viewer with normal eyesight looking at a 25 centimeter print 25 centimeters from their nose. Now, that's a very specific case, isn't it? If you change that, it changes the depth of field calculations. The reason it does that is because if in your print, which is so big, you appear to have a certain amount that's sharp, if you enlarge that print, at some point you realize that there wasn't as much sharp as you thought there was. And if you look at the image on the screen in front of you now, that left-hand image here, and these are both the same file. What I've done is I've dropped the same image onto the page and magnified one and not the other. So they're the same image data. You should be able to see, I hope, that 3 lines of text are readable and look sharp, roughly. But when you enlarge it by a factor of 3 or 4, you'll see that only 1 line of text is in fact technically sharp. And this is why I was very specific about saying the zone of acceptable sharpness. So the upshot of this is that as you make a bigger and bigger print, or you view it on a bigger screen, your depth of field reduces. And conversely, when you look at an image on a phone, your depth of field could be a lot more than you were expecting. Now that's a tricky one, because you don't know when you take the picture how that image is going to be viewed. And really, to sort of summarize that, is that if you're calculating or guessing at depth of field based on just generic information, and then you come to make a big print, you may be surprised at what's not in focus in that image that you thought was in focus when you actually looked at it on the back of the camera, because you're enlarging not only the detail, but you're also revealing at the same time that tiny degree of blur that's not visible in a small print or a small screen, but as you enlarge it, it becomes visible to the point where it no longer looks sharp. So you can see why I was hesitating at the beginning when I said that this is quite slippery and calculating this stuff becomes quite difficult. Okay. Any more questions up to this point? Because those are the 5 concepts that we need now to distill down into practical applications. So I'm hoping everybody's with me. Nobody's disappeared. We've still got the same number of people. So there's nobody. Well, if anybody's nodded off, then they haven't actually logged out. So I'll call that a win. Okay. So moving on. Oh, and I just also want to prove that last point. I'll come back to this picture in a couple of slides, but in this one, we've got this particular image of this gentleman in India, and this was taken on the Leica Q. Focused, obviously, on his head, which is where you would normally focus. And if you look carefully, and again, I don't know how big this is on your screen, which takes me to my previous point, but I'm hoping that if you look carefully, you should agree that his face is sharp, this hand is sharp, this hand is sharp, this stick is sharp, and his foot is sharp. And behind him, to me, looking on the screen, that edge of that pillar looks sharp as well. So if I was to make a guess at the depth of field, I'd say it's maybe 1 meter or so from the knee here, maybe the leg, through to a little bit behind him, okay? Now, somebody just brought to my attention that there are some questions in the questions panel, so I've missed those. I will come to those, and I'll come back to this point. First question from British Berry. This was earlier, and Ralph Domino's actually already answered that one. I will leave that answer to stand because it's exactly what I would say. Ian Pickin, do you use spot or field in focus mode? Now, that is a topic for my next webinar, focusing. This is depth of field, and I know they are linked, but focusing and depth of field are two entirely different operations. And the next month will be exactly on that topic, on how to focus and how to judge focus. So if you'll excuse me, I'm going to move on and stick back to my topic of depth of field, Ian. Right, that's those done. Thank you for... and then Luke, sorry. You mentioned the focal plane and how in front behind of things get progressively blurry. Is this true for what's on the left and right sides as well? Ooh, is the focal plane spherical and not a plane? Very good question. It depends on the lens design. It depends a lot on the lens design. And if anybody here ever lurks on DP review websites or the really, really geeky photography forums, you'll see how people test lenses photographing flat objects like walls. Now, if that lens is designed to give you a flat plane of focus, then yes, that will be sharp. But not all lenses are designed for that. Copy lenses are, enlarger lenses are, but photography lenses not necessarily. How many times in a photograph is what's in the corner of a picture in the same plane as what's in the center? So it's a little bit of a fallacy that a lens which isn't sharp in the corners on a flat subject is actually a poor lens. Case in point, like a Noctilux 50mm, that's got a very curved depth of field. But you see, it's designed that way because it makes the focus fall off even quicker in the corners. So it exaggerates the effect of the depth of field. So that's really tricky stuff. It's a very good question. So I think the answer to that one is not necessarily. And you'd think it was a good idea actually having a flat field of focus, but in some cases it's not. Depends on the lens design entirely. And you can sometimes tell from MTF charts whether you've got curvature of the actual focal plane or not. Yes, that's a tricky one. Thank you for that one, Luke. Let's get back to this. Okay, back to this picture. Visually, this image has maybe 1 meter of depth of field. But if I enlarge it to really, really quite big, you'll see that in fact, his hand is not sharp. And this hand is not sharp. And I would argue that it's sharp from maybe the middle, from his elbow, maybe the elbow here. Obviously, his chest and the green cloth is sharp, his face is sharp, but the edge of that column there, not sharp. So now we've enlarged it, that depth of field has dropped to maybe 1/3 of what it is, what it was, what it looked like it was, because it all depends on the enlargement, okay? That is really, really counterintuitive, but nevertheless, it is true. All right, nobody asked me this question yet. I was rather expecting that. There's this relates very much to what we've been talking about so far, because depth of field is connected to those factors. And also because depth of field increases as you move the focus point further away from the camera by focusing the camera, there comes a point where the depth of field extends and it extends in an increasing manner to the point where the furthest point is the horizon. And that means that everything from the horizon to a certain near point is acceptably sharp. Acceptably sharp. Now, given that I've just demonstrated to you that that has a lot to do with the print size, you may realize that hyperfocal distance isn't as useful a concept as you might think it is. It is useful up to a point, but you actually have a lot less depth of field than you think you do with the really high resolution sensors. So like the SL2, 47 megapixels, the Q2 has probably a third to a quarter the depth of field of, let's say, a 12 megapixel camera, if you enlarge it to the largest size that the print can be made to. So again, we're changing more than one variable. But if you view it in that 25 centimeters from your nose, then yes, you can have hyperfocal distance. And the way it works is this. This is a normal depth of field. So focused at 15 meters and at an example f-stop of f4, and it doesn't really matter what it is, just for the example of this, you may have 3 trees in focus. So let's say, for argument's sake, from 10 to 30 meters, it doesn't really matter. But if I stop down a bit more to f16, you also will notice, if you're looking carefully, that the depth of field isn't symmetrical. There's 2/3 on the far side of the focus point and 1/3 on the near side. And this gets more symmetrical as you bring the focus point towards you. So for close objects, it's about 50-50. But as you move your focus point further away from you, it gets less symmetrical. So the further point extends even more rapidly towards the distance. So there comes a point where if you focus your lens at 15 meters and you're using a certain aperture, in this case, let's say f16, you'll have all 4 trees and the mountains in the distance acceptably sharp. But you need to know what this distance is. And it's not that easy to calculate. And I'll show you how to do that in a sec. Question, Ralph Domino. Nick, how does depth of field work with a lens baby lens? And do you have much control with depth of field? Okay, there's some people out there really trying to catch me out. So I'll come back to that one in a second. Let me just check. There's another question come up here. I'll just read that one and see if I can join them together. No, I'll have to answer them separately. Okay, lens baby question. The lens baby works because you are able to change, you can see my hands to the side here, you can change the orientation of the lens elements compared to the camera. Like a tilt shift lens. And I'm not going to get into tilt shift lenses and all that stuff this evening. That's another advanced topic. But the lens baby allows you to distort deliberately, because when lenses are made, they're usually made such that all of the lens elements are exactly flat, aligned with each other. They're perfectly square to each other. Okay. As soon as you muck around with that, it throws all this stuff off. And that's how you can get those weird effects with things like lens babies, which are like a flexible lens, if that's how I understand your question anyway. And that really throws things off. So you can, in fact, tilt the plane of focus. So you can tilt it. Normally it's away from you at 90 degrees, but if you tilt you can twist the lens and you can rotate it top to bottom, left to right, and do all sorts of weird things. That's heading into some much more advanced territory, which I won't have time to cover this evening. But that's how lens babies work. The other question was, it's disappeared. Where's it gone? I'm sure there was a question somebody asked me a question about the Leica Q, and it seems to have vanished. Maybe you could type it in again, or I don't know why that's vanished. It's definitely here. Oh, there we go. Tony, how does a Leica Q, for example, on full auto, balance depth of field and speed and ISO? Does depth of field come into the equation? No. On auto, it's all about exposure. Okay. Is there some sort of medium algorithm the camera chooses? No, when you're using a camera, say in program mode, what it's doing is prioritizing the shutter speed in relation to the actual focal length of the lens. And when we talked about apertures and shutter speeds a while ago, I was talking about this. If you have a zoom lens, for instance, on a camera and it's in program mode, as you change the focal length, you'll see the minimum shutter speed it uses goes up and down to try and protect you from camera shake, but it has nothing to do with depth of field. Okay. Now, there are some cameras on the market that I do believe allow you to choose on the screen on the back of the camera a near and a far point, and it will calculate the aperture you need to do that. Okay, so that's not exactly anything a Leica will do, but I do have something I'll show you in a minute which gives you a clue about that, so bear with me. But yeah, that's a good question. And another question here from Sam: are mirrorless digital cameras as responsive with depth of field as a mirrored digital camera, body? Again, you're talking about focusing here. Depth of field is completely independent of any brand or anything. We're talking about physics and optics here. There is a slight aspect of brand and design here. As I said before, if you design a lens with a curved focal plane and also a lens which lowers the contrast with loss of focus, like the SL Summicron lenses, you can actually play around with the way depth of field appears to a limited extent. But you're talking about responsive focusing, and that's a different thing. What that is doing is moving the depth of field range backwards and forwards to place it over the subject and focus on whatever it is you want to focus on. Depth of field is purely that zone in front of the camera where you've got a range of sharpness, or depth, a little bit of depth of sharpness, depth of focus, of course, depth of field. Okay. British Berry: will a polarizer help in increasing depth of field? No, in fact, it would reduce it, because you may have to change the aperture to let more light in, or if you kept the same aperture, you'd have to make a longer shutter speed to set the lane to let more light in, because the polarizing filter reduces the light. It's a dark filter, so it has nothing to do with depth of field directly. So if you use the same aperture and chose to change other settings to compensate for the polarizing filter, then you'd end up with the same depth of field. Okay. Anyway, back to my diagram. So hyperfocal distance and how we would work that out. It is a little bit tricky, but I'm going to try and explain how that works by going to this slide. This is I think it's 35mm Summilux on the Leica, and I have one here. And if these two slides don't show me what I want to show you, I've got an overhead camera I can show you, but that's this little lens here. What you're looking at here, and I need to make it clear that not many lenses have these markings on anymore. A lot of, including the SL lenses, a lot of the lenses that are autofocus have maybe, if you're lucky, a tiny window in the top that you can see the focusing distance, but they don't have these lines. And what these lines are telling you, okay, see if I can explain this clearly. Right now, this lens, that marker there, means it's focused on infinity. And because it's a mechanical lens, you can't rotate the focusing ring any further. It hits a hard stop. You may have noticed on autofocus lenses that you can keep turning the focusing ring as long as you like, and it never gets to an end point. Okay, that's because of the way autofocus mechanisms work. But with a mechanical lens like this one, you actually have a hard stop, and that is at infinity. So this lens is focused on the furthest possible point. That's infinity. That's the horizon. If you were using an aperture of f/16, see there's a 16 mark here and a 16 mark here. That line hits the lens barrel there and there. So with the lens as it is now, you would have everything in focus from 2.5 meters through to beyond infinity. Yeah? That's what these lines are for. So if I turned the focus such that the infinity mark here was here, I would then have focus at f/16 from there through to wherever the other f/16 line lined up with, which is probably about 1.2. Okay. Now, hopefully that's clear, because I can't rotate that on the screen. I do have one I can show you with an overhead camera if you like, but that is So someone's already preempted one of my questions here. That is how you set your hyperfocal distance. You choose an aperture and then you read off the scale. Basically, you move your infinity point to the right-hand line of whatever aperture you're using at 11, 8, 5.6. And then you read off the other line, corresponding aperture, and that would be your minimum depth of field. Okay, I hope that makes sense. This is how we used to do it. Now, I'm just going to come back to the questions here. Owen says, SL will put the numbers on the top screen when in manual. You've preempted me. I'm going to show you that in a sec. You're absolutely right. Thing is, though, and do you remember what I said about your standard print size? These engravings on these lenses and virtually all basic depth of field calculations are based on that 25 centimeter print at a normal viewing distance, like a book. So if you were intending to make an A4 print and you were expecting it to be viewed at this sort of distance, which is not unreasonable, then these markings work. And you can absolutely set even your zone focusing for street photography. I mean, if you were shooting at f5.6, for instance, you could set the middle line, which is the focus point, to say 3 meters, and you would reckon that you might have 2 to 5 meters in focus. That's what zone focusing is. Okay, I know we're talking about focusing next month, but still. But only if you didn't make a print bigger than that A4 size. When you make prints bigger and bigger, like a double page in a book or a big print, you'll see that that zone of focus is a lot narrower than you thought it was because you've enlarged it. Okay, that's quite tricky. Vincent, this is how we always get our cine lenses right. Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And characters move between these distances. Yes, that's right. And with the movies, for instance, you can set focus marks on lenses and you have a character move from position A to position B and you can move the focus thing. It's called, basically, it's pulling focus. That's another discussion. We're on focusing here. Let's get back to depth of field. If you were to make a print that was as big as the camera was capable of doing, which is, again, not an easy specification to make, but let's say you could go 3 times bigger than your A4. Let's say you were going to like AO, should be 4 times as wide, wouldn't it? Then you can adjust by using 3 or 4 stops different in your calculation. So if you were shooting at f16, you would use the f5.6 or even the 2.8 lines, which is a lot less, as you can imagine. So each multiple of the print size, you have to change by very approximately 1 stop of depth of field or aperture difference. So if you were enlarging the print to 4 times what you might, 4 times compared to your standard print, then you would have to change it by 4 stops. It makes that much difference. It really does. And you can prove this for yourself with the depth of field calculators. Now, I want to show you this because Owen did mention this. So let me just turn on a camera I have here. And I'm hoping that if I swap, hopefully this is going to work. Yay. In fact, we'll do that there. How's that? If this is the top of an SL. This is the actual screen on the top of the camera. And if I hold down the shutter button, halfway, the display changes. And what you should be able to read now is at f8, my back focus, which is the distance, is infinity. My focus is at 8.8 and my front is 4.3. That would give me my hyperfocal distance, because what I've done is I've focused just to the point where that infinity just starts to show. There, a bit more, and there, 9.2, so around 9 meters. So that is now the depth of field for this particular lens. I should also mention that the calculations on these SLs are done at a much lower, smaller circular confusion, at a much higher quality, and they do accurately represent the depth of field for larger prints. So the calculations on these lenses are done for a circular confusion of 0.03 millimeters, standard. The ones for the Leicas are 0.01 or 0.015. I can't quite remember which, because I did ask with Stefan Rau at Leica in Germany, who's the product manager and designer for the SL series, and he confirmed with the engineers that they use a completely different specification for that display on the SL specifically. So that's really useful to know. So you can actually rely on that more accurately. That's because it's a much high resolution sensor, and the lenses that you've got on the screen now, these are legacy designs, not the optics, but the casing and the engravings from film days. And film was about 8 megapixels, 10 megapixels, depending on how you measure it, equivalent. But now we're up to 47. We need to recalculate everything. And there wouldn't be room on this dial to do that. They'd be so close together. So the SL engineers have incorporated that into the SL, SL2, SL2S, CL, and S3, those cameras. Okay. All right. So Owen says, sorry for jumping ahead. No, don't apologise. It was a good observation, and obviously you're aware of that, but it was good to bring it up. Okay. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on these. I just want to make one point to do with that lens sensor resolution business. What you're looking at on the screen now is these guys here, photopills.com. They do an app for your iPhone, but they also have a website where you can go to an advanced depth of field calculator, which is what you see on the right-hand side. This is pretty good, and it gives more information than you probably need. It does include, down the bottom, a hyperfocal distance graphic, which gives you a representation of what the numbers above mean, these distances here. So it's very useful. But the key thing here, and I'm going to draw your attention back to the picture of the old guy sitting in the archway in India, because that was taken on Leica Q. So Leica Q, I've chosen Leica Q, full frame 24 megapixels. I'm going to take a wild guess that the subject distance was 3 meters. I'm guessing slightly there, but it makes my point, as you'll see. I know the aperture was 1.7 because it says so in the metadata, and I know the focal length's 28 because that's what Leica Qs are. And if you look down here, you'll see depth of field 1.07 meters. You remember I said that it looked like the depth of field was about 1 meter in that size of enlargement. But when I enlarged it, it was clear that there wasn't as much depth of field as we thought. If you want to test out and calculate the minimal depth of field that you've got, not the maximum, but the minimum depth of field at that aperture, you need to change this setting here from manufactured standard to 20/20 vision there. And if you look carefully, you'll see that's now gone to 0.3 meters, which was my guess, remember, about how much depth of field we had. So what this is doing is changing this number here, which is a circle of confusion, which I don't want to get into in the mathematical side of things, to a much lower number, which is more relevant to big prints made with high resolution sensors. Now, there's lots and lots of depth of field calculators out there. This is one of many. Some of them allow you to change that circle of confusion number, but unless you know what it means and what it's for, that's not going to help you. I found this very useful because you can simply change this to think of it as high resolution and standard resolution. And if you go with the high resolution choice here, these depth of field figures are more realistic because they are now a worst case scenario. Remember, if your print is smaller, progressively smaller than your maximum size, down to an iPad or a computer screen, you get more depth of field than you think. So you're gaining. If you work the other way, from a small print upwards, you get to a point where you go, hang on a sec, that's not sharp anymore. So it's a really useful way of working. So if you want to just take a photograph of that screen or wait for the replay on YouTube and you can see that link, or just write down photo pills, it's easy enough to find. Okay. Question from Hans Dieter. What if I use a Leica M lens on an M8 with a C sensor? Oh, well, that would, if our memory serves me, that was APS-C size? I can't quite remember, but you'd have to make that crop factor calculation modifier of about 1.5. So I would use, if you were using a depth of field calculator like this, you would choose a camera with an APS-C size sensor. If you don't want to do it this way and you want to use the lens engravings, what I would do is one stop more depth of field than you thought you had, all other things being equal. Okay, so whatever the engravings are for f5.6, you could use the f8 line. That would be about right for an APS-C sensor on an M lens, normal M lens. Okay. Any more questions in there? Just checking. I think we're okay. Right, so I think we're getting to, I better get going quickly because we're already, I knew this was going to take longer than I was expecting, so I hope you're all okay with me pressing on here. So this is my advice to you in a practical sense. Then I want to go through a couple of case studies just to show you how these things vary, and then we'll be done. Don't worry too much about calculating depth of field. It's just going to mess with your head. It's not something practical that you can do in the field. Not unless you've got a very specific application, maybe in the studio, then you might have time. But I tend to think in terms of not much or lots. So I'm shooting wide open, looking for as little depth of field as possible to separate my subject from a background, or I'm looking for plenty so that the majority of my subject is sharp, particularly if it's at a distance. Okay, that's a really important distinction. Okay, is not to obsess about the numbers. It's very, very easy to get bogged down in this stuff. What I wanted to do this evening was to try and show you, A, how slippery the whole concept is, and B, how it's a creative choice, and that creative choice comes down to lots or not much. And as Peter Carber, our senior lens designer, would say, why wouldn't you shoot it at wide open all the time? That is how our lenses are designed. Okay, so depth of field increases with smaller apertures, so going from f8 to f11, so physically smaller apertures, which is a counterintuitively larger number, remember. Increasing subject distance, wider angle of view, the field of view in the viewfinder. Decreasing viewing size, so as your prints get smaller or your viewing device gets smaller, depth of field increases, and smaller sensor sizes. Conversely, depth of field decreases basically with the opposite. Wider apertures, f2, something like that, closer subjects, and very strongly decreases with close subjects. Narrow angle of view, telephoto, increasing viewing size. As your prints get bigger, your depth of field reduces, and larger sensors. Okay. Right, so in use, here's some examples of how I tend to think about these things. This is my dog. This was shot on the 50mm Summicron SL, the beautiful 50mm on the SL2. So it's close, so that's less depth of field, DOF minus. It's a 50mm lens, which is neither wide nor telephoto, magnification of 1, so no change. And it's f2, so depth of field, not much. And the net result is not much depth of field. And Charlie stands out nicely from the background. Easy, okay? That's a real no-brainer. Nice and close, wide aperture, you're going to get limited depth of field. And again, a large-ish sensor. If I shot this with an iPhone, okay, with the same framing and the same everything else, you'd find that had a lot more depth of field, and he would not stand out from the background anywhere near as much, because I'd be using a wider angle lens and I'd be using a much smaller sensor, and that wouldn't be enough to be cancelled out from the fact that I'm going a lot closer. So something like this, 50mm lens as well, but I'm focused at infinity. So even though this was shot at f2.8, which you would probably say is a relatively wide aperture, because it's at infinity, I have enough depth of field to keep things sharp down in the foreground and in the distance, because that foreground is probably a kilometre away and the distance is probably 10 kilometres away. So you could actually argue that aperture has virtually no effect on the image on anything over 200 or 300 meters away. You could calculate that if you really wanted to, and it would depend on the lens to a certain extent. But with this lens, at this distance, everything's sharp. So far focus, depth of field plus, 50mm lens neutral, a wide aperture, depth of field minus, but the net result is plenty of depth of field. Now I'm playing around a little bit by mucking around with the different specifications. Now we're talking about a wide angle lens, which normally has more depth of field, and it does, but by going in very close and by using a wide aperture, I have now got the effect of very, very limited depth of field. This is all out of focus here, and it's only really her face that's sharp. So I've still got narrow depth of field, even though I'm using a wide angle lens. So I'm changing things up a little bit here. Question, Chris Osborne, for the average landscape photographer is looking for acceptable depth of field, is there any benefit from focus stacking as against using hyperfocal distance? Absolutely, and I will leave you with a thought about that before we finish, because there is a downside to hyperfocal distance, which is extremely significant, but I will come back to that point in a sec. Bear with me. Here's a telephoto lens, which normally would have less depth of field, at a wide aperture, which would also normally have less depth of field, but photographed from a long way away, out of a plane or a helicopter coming in to land at Sydney Airport, in fact. And everything is sharp in that picture. It's completely sharp here, and it's completely sharp here. I'm at a slightly oblique view as well, which does change things slightly, but everything in that image is crisp, even if you enlarge it to the limit. Okay? That's because I'm a long way away, and there's no way you can use limited depth of field in that circumstance to draw attention to things. You just can't. It's not possible. Okay? You could use a telephoto lens, a much bigger telephoto lens, but then I'm changing the framing. I could zoom in on one particular crane, and then I might have limited depth of field, but now I've only got a very, very small image, or part of an image, so I've changed things up even more. Then, this is hyperfocal distance. This is using an 18mm lens, which is super wide. I'm using f11, which is quite a narrow aperture, so lots of depth of field, and it was focused about here. And I know from experience that I will now get everything here, which is about a meter away, through to the volcano in the distance, nice and sharp. But that's because it's a super wide angle lens, and I've used it a lot. I wouldn't have calculated that. I would simply knew that was the case. I basically focus on about 3 meters on the scale, and I know that f11, everything's sharp. Okay, so that's just experience. However, and this comes back to Chris Osborne's question, and Owen's just fired up a question, is the downside that the actual plane of focus is at a random point? No, I'm not sure I understand the question. Maybe you could reword that one for me whilst I'm answering the previous one or discussing this. Okay, if you're using your aperture to maximize your depth of field, you might think that's a good idea, and in many circumstances maybe it is. But given that I've demonstrated that the depth of field gets less when you do big prints, for instance, you might think you need to stop down even more. There is this thing in optics called diffraction error. And what that is that when you shine light through a small hole, which is an aperture, if you think about it, that's an actual hole in the lens, an aperture. If that lens is very, very small, if that hole is very, very small, light actually bends ever so slightly at the edge of the hole, where it just skims past the metal on the aperture and the lens, just a little bit. But as the hole gets smaller and smaller, the amount of the bending, which blurs the image, becomes significant. And this limits the resolution, because there comes a point where the light diffraction error, the blurring of the lens, absolutely destroys the original resolution of the lens and the sensor. So, and this is physics. This is nothing to do with camera brands. This is nothing to do with lens design or, quality. It's pure physics, and it depends on the sensor size. So there comes a point where you are chasing your tail, or the law of diminishing returns. If you stop down to f22, you might get everything theoretically in focus, but the resolution will have dropped to the point where you've got more in focus, but it's less sharp than if you shot at f8, when you've got less in focus, but the bits that are in focus are considerably sharper. And it's a trade-off, and you can't get past it. You just can't. Except for, as Owen Howitt points out in the chat, you can shoot more than one picture at different focus points, and use the sharp bits from each picture. It's called focus stacking, and that will be the topic of another talk down the track. I think there's actually a video on my YouTube channel, or the Leica Academy YouTube channel, about that. If you look, I was photographing, I forget now, I've done so many, but yeah, I'm not going to go into the depths of that, but basically you can't use hyperfocal distance beyond a certain point because you will end up degrading the image. And the numbers that we're talking about are these: SL2, anything past f8, and you will start to see a degradation of the image. Try it. Shoot 2 pictures, one at 5.6 and one at the maximum aperture, like 22 or something, and I guarantee the image won't look as sharp. Full frame, 24 megapixels, f11-ish and beyond. APS-C, f8, so even less, and a compact camera even less than that. That's because the little pixels on the sensor are that much smaller, and that's a limiting factor as well. So as an example, f16 on my SL2 gives me the same resolution as a 12 megapixel camera. That's pretty scary, okay? So something to bear in mind. Okay, depth of field in use. So really it comes down to this. Always, always, always make sure that the one thing that you want to draw the attention of your viewer to is where you're focused and is sharp. That's the key thing. How much either side of that is sharp is less important than the one thing that you're trying to demonstrate, draw attention to is sharp. And in the case of portraits, it's got to be the eye. It doesn't even matter if 2 eyes are sharp, just the nearest one. And in this particular image, if I was to enlarge this shot, you'd see that this eye here is slightly sharper than this eye because this was shot on the Noctilux at f0.95. I don't care that this eye is not quite sharp, but I do care that this one is sharp. That's critical. How much this is out of focus, not that bothered. What I'm interested in is how much the background is out of focus. That's the key thing here, okay? This is separation. Then, if you have 2 subjects, you may be forced to choose between them, because if you try and stop down so much that they're both sharp, you'll either end up with a softer image or it may be impossible, because this is taken with about a 100mm lens, and even at f22, the guy in the distance is never going to be sharp. It is much, much better to have something really sharp and not sharp at all than to have it really sharp and almost sharp. Almost sharp looks like a mistake. Very much out of focus looks like it's a creative choice that you've made. It was intentional. Okay. Distant view. f1.7. This is a shot out of a helicopter of Brisbane. Everything's sharp in this picture at f1.7. So as long as the subject is sharp, the aperture has no bearing in this subject at all. Distant subject, whatever aperture you want to use, doesn't really matter. You might as well use the widest aperture you can so that you've got the highest shutter speed possible to get a sharp picture, okay? So in conclusion, don't worry too much about the numbers. Doesn't matter whether it's f4.5 or 5.6 or 2.9 or whatever. There's more to it than that, okay? Use the wide apertures and close subjects to hold the viewer's attention. And again, as I said, backgrounds that are mistakenly out of focus or just a little bit out of focus can be distracting. So be bold and be clear with your settings. That's why I said all or nothing, like not much depth of field or lots of depth of field, okay? And again, for vistas and large subjects, the aperture has a lot less effect than you might think. There we go. 7 minutes over time. Sorry about that. That's depth of field, and I hope I've successfully skirted around the calculation side of things, because I'm not a big fan of being that detailed about it. I think you probably picked that up from me. It's a practical solution. It's not much or lots, with a few little gotchas thrown in there. Not next Wednesday, the Wednesday after, so the 15th, we will be having Christian Fletcher on the show, who will be discussing landscape photography, which is of interest to everybody. He lives in a beautiful part of the world in southwest WA. He's been out shooting on the SL2 for the last 18 months or so, and he's good fun. And I know some of you know Christian personally and have seen some of his talks, so that will be in 2 weeks' time, so check in for that. And then I'll put the next one of these Take Better Photographs topics on the website soon. It'll be in the next newsletter, and that will be on focusing. So I'm trying to draw together the threads that we've already discussed. And now we know what depth of field is. We can now get to the point where we can apply the depth of field to the subject by using the camera's focusing mechanisms to place our limited depth of field exactly where we want it in the image. Okay. All right. Let me just see if there's any questions that I have missed. Checking there, that's all good. Oh, you're very welcome. Everybody's saying thank you. That's great. It's always nice to be appreciated. Just one last question if anybody's got one. Otherwise, I think probably kept you all long enough. I hope that was useful for you. This will be available to replay on this same link that you're watching it now for a while. But then what I do is I'm actually going to take this recording and I'm going to put it on our YouTube channel in, I don't know, actually it won't be for a little bit because I'm going away photographing. Gosh, getting actually away photographing. Sorry for those of you who can't do that at the moment, but I am getting to do that for a few days. So it'll be end of next week sometime, but I will leave it here to be replayed if you want to go back, pick up some of those links or whatever. All right. Ooh, somebody's saying there was a 2-second delay in the audio. That's, I will check that out because I can see from my statistics that there was not a single drop frame in that broadcast. So thank you. I will definitely attend to that. And I will also fix it when I put the recording on YouTube because I can separate the audio and jink it together so it works out nicely. Anyway, all right, everybody. Thank you so much for your attendance this evening. And I will talk to you in a couple of weeks. All right. Goodbye for now.